Thank you, Sandra, for setting up the recording. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to the webinar today with SEHTA and Native on the secret weapon, the value creation through innovation and design. We're delighted to welcome Marcus Hogarth and Matt Legg from Native. Marcus is the president and CEO of Native. He's had over 20 years of experience leading Native's global creation output and has got a vast depth of knowledge in leading numerous global design initiatives for some of the world's greatest health technology brands. Also joining us is Matt Legg, Vice President of Native. He's a key member of Native's creative leadership team with a hands-on collaborative approach for both tactical and strategic problem solving, which drives design innovation within their studios. Max has got over 2 years of experience in healthcare innovation. So again, a very well-experienced lead in this area. So just a little bit of housekeeping for all of those that have joined us. We do have a chat room to raise any questions. So please use the chat room and ask any questions throughout the session. We will break off for questions and post them to Marcus and Matt as we go along. So, please do post them. We will be sharing the recording of this video, this webinar with you as a link after the event, along with the slides, the PDF and the feedback form. So it's my great pleasure to hand over to Marcus and Matt.
Thank you, Claire. Good morning, everybody. We'll just dive in. We really appreciate SEHTA for giving us the chance to talk to everybody this morning. We'll tell you a little bit about us, but mainly we'll just try and talk about how we see design's role in the future of healthcare innovation. So hopefully that'll be of interest to the people on the call today. As Claire said, don't hesitate to interrupt and ask questions rather than us just monologue for 40 minutes. It'd be great to have a dialogue where things are interesting. So firstly, just who are Native? So we're a innovation company, design innovation, based in London with a satellite team out in San Francisco. We've been going for about 30 years, independent company, and about 80 people. So very diverse skill sets and capabilities in the organization. We work in many industries, but in particular, we love working in the healthcare and life sciences space. So if we quickly talk about things that are completely not relevant to this conversation, we've worked in consumer electronics for a long time, designing beautiful products that people desire and aspire to. Could be computers, loudspeakers, running machines. So lots of things that are beautifully made and desirable for some of the world's greatest brands. The relevance for that within medtech and healthcare is that we've spent a long time understanding what people really care about, and not just care about when they're ill or when they're interacting with the healthcare space, but actually in their full kind of 360 view of life, which we think is really important and helps us to become better designers when it comes to healthcare. The equivalent principles work in our work in automotive design. Again, everything we design is for putting the end user at the forefront. So trying to understand ease of use, kind of quality experiences, creating timeless digital and physical experiences that are sustainable and valuable. And this happens for us with some great companies, Bentley, Audi, we've worked with for over 20 years, Ford, Lincoln. So companies around the world come to us for that kind of insight. And then probably obviously the most relevant space for this conversation today is the work we do in healthcare. So that work spans from chronic care with companies like Coloplast, working with companies like Baxter in the US, pharmaceutical companies like Boehringer Ingelheim, and life sciences companies like Illumina, for kind of global leaders in genetic sequencing. So again, we think that multidisciplinary approach and diversity really helps us deliver better solutions, helps understand people's behaviors and desires, And we think that's kind of an additive thing when we look at, how we approach design. So how do we approach design? We're always looking at for a holistic perspective. So if we think about, we started many years ago as industrial designers, but at the age of the internet, we became digital designers as well. That's led us to become service designers, technologists, strategists, researchers. Everything we need to do to understand, the holistic challenges that face, end users, global companies, health systems. We think it's incredibly valuable to be able to address all of those at one point. So bringing all of that data, that knowledge together, not just to solve one piece of the puzzle, but to actually be involved in trying to solve the whole puzzle. So just think about this morning, things we're going to try and maybe talk about and hopefully offer some insight on. We're going to talk about design and innovation, creating value.
Can you just move into the camera a little bit more, please? We can't actually see you. Lovely, thank you.
Okay, very close, Matt. So innovation, creating value obviously is really important. How we operate in a purposeful industry, we'll talk about that a little bit because I think it's quite important. Collaboration and design process. And then we'll index on this multi-dimensional approach, and then also a little bit on ambition and transformation. We think it's incredibly important that we reach higher and go further in this space. So if we start to think about value and return, so is design worthwhile? Should we even bother? So, smarter people than me think we should. So this is BCG. This is a study they did that essentially companies embracing design innovation, brought an increase of at least 17% in shareholder return. That's pretty significant. If you look at other levers that you can pull that have the same effect, there aren't many. So I think that's pretty vital and pretty important. One thing I should just say, Claire, just for your benefit, I can't see the chat while I'm presenting, so if you just interrupt me if something comes through that,
Absolutely, we will do.
Yeah, I'll let you know, Marcus.
Thank you. Okay, so again, on delivering returns, we've been, lucky enough, or we've worked hard enough to help our clients deliver financial returns themselves. So, Coloplast was a Danish healthcare company. We started working within 2010, their market cap was $3 billion. It's now about $30 billion. Again, not all down to design, but design plays a huge role in their business and how they've grown. Similar with Bowers Wilkins, so the British audio company. We started working with them 30 years ago. They were a very small, niche cottage industry company, and we helped them become a global brand. And then, huge companies, HP in the US, we help them with design, across the whole portfolio, so hundreds of products a year, and all trying to constantly keep them relevant with technology and in touch with their users. So we talked briefly about being purpose-driven. I think it's an important one when we think about probably why we're all on this call, why we all love designing in the healthcare space. We probably, I assume, want to make the world a little bit better. We want to be successful. We want companies to be successful. Money is important, but we can make money in other industries. So I think we're here because we care greatly, and that's both a blessing and a curse. So I think we have to be very careful when we think that everything we're doing is good because we care. And I think you also have to look at it and say, we have to be exceptionally good at what we do. Every day we have to be switched on, great at our jobs, have the ambition, not just think that we want to do good things, so we will do good things. I see a lot of terrible solutions or terrible interactions if I go into hospital. Now, none of those have been created with poor intent. They'll all have been created by people who cared. The issue is it's not just about caring, it's about being able to strategically solve and then deliver on those problems. So we have to be ultra cautious and ultra careful that our compassion, our empathy doesn't cloud our judgment when it comes to, are we creating exceptional solutions? If we think about process, so I'm sure many of you have either used or talked about most of the processes we're describing on the left-hand side of this page. Again, process is vital for companies and industries to move forward, to progress, to hit timeframes, meet budgets, to go through regulatory approval. Process is critical, but also process can again become an excuse. It can become an excuse for why we don't make things better. The time limits were too great. The regulatory landscape was too difficult. Reimbursement was challenging. Design didn't get involved until late in the process. So we have to make sure that when we're designing, that we don't allow process to inhibit or limit our capabilities. We work with process, but ultimately we have to keep that focus and that goal in mind of what we're trying to achieve. Which, when it comes to think about a linear approach, so a lot of people would think of the innovation and development process as being very linear. So you start at the beginning, you end at the end, products in the market, services in the market. So you may put it, research at the beginning, definition, strategy. By the end of it, you're going through compliance and regulatory, and eventually you're selling a product or a solution. It's kind of a trusted shorthand approach to how development works, but I think it can lead to challenges, and we've seen that on many occasions in many industries, not just in the healthcare space. This was a drawing I asked my kids to do a couple of weeks ago. I think it's called The Exquisite Corpse, but I'm sure you've all played the game where you fold a piece of paper and you get a blank piece, you draw something, you draw a head, you fold it over, the next person draws a body, legs, feet, etc. It's fun and interesting, but it's not unlike the way we sometimes see the challenges of the baton pass that happens with design and innovation in organizations and companies. So with the best intention, design may hand over to engineering, or research hands over to design, or engineering hands over to marketing. The fluidity and the consistency is vital. Those points where it feels like we're handing over to the next stage in the process are the points when we're most at risk of losing track, of getting something wrong, not sharing the ambition, not sharing that single unified vision of what we're trying to achieve. And you can walk around most environments in the world and find exactly those challenges. Things that were a good idea implemented badly. Things that were added complexity rather than simplicity into the system that they were designing in. And everyone can kind of wash their hands and say, I did my bit really well. But I think it's really important when we think about design that we actually have to go further than that. We really have to take not control of the whole process, but have involvement throughout the process to make sure this works. So when we look at that process, obviously deep empathy is critical. So we spend a lot of time, trying to live people's lives, trying to not just ask them questions about what they do, but actually observe, see the things they don't talk about, that they don't say, but yet we can still witness. And in parallel to that, we're also trying to understand technology, challenges, manufacturing, new capabilities, AI, supply chain, sales channels, all of those things are critical to be able to merge that insight we get from people into the kind of knowledge that we need to know about, the opportunities or the challenges that we face in terms of technology or sales. And then we try to develop that into opportunities. So all of that knowledge coming together to try and understand what's the possibilities, what could happen from this point onwards. Are we well informed? Do we know enough? And then, how do we translate that knowledge into understandable action? And can we do that early enough that we can get buy-in and ambition and understanding? And then here we're talking about collaboration. And I think we talk about process, we talk about methodology that people have developed that more and more people are aware of. And often we're told that collaboration solves everything. Come together, people work in creative ways, and when suddenly you've ignited a fire. We don't necessarily see that happening on a regular basis. Just coming together, teams coming together, doesn't necessarily mean that there's a spark that actually ignites the fuel. We need collaboration. We need people to work together. We need different disciplines and different capabilities to come together. But we also need design and innovation and inspiration to be that moment where ideas are formed, and they need to be formed at the very beginning. This can't be something where, oh, we've got a technical package, we think we know what we're doing, we'll get design in later. That initial vision, is critical. It happens early in the process. And it's also critical, it's multidimensional. It cannot be a one-dimensional answer. We can't just say, oh, we'll make this better by doing this one thing. So we have to be multidimensional and wonderful, from the very beginning. So that means we have to be thinking about design, ultimately, products, hardware, apps, connectivity, revenue opportunities. All of those things have to be considered at once. Otherwise, we're vulnerable. We don't know what we're actually really trying to achieve. So your problem isn't going to be one of these things individually. It's going to be every one of these topics all at once. And probably if you look at it now, that AI challenge that a couple of years ago was only a small challenge is probably now in every business, being discussed, and people are concerned about what does it mean? What do we do? AI has become this almost a metaphor for how on earth do we create, how do we innovate with infinite possibilities. Our view would be exactly the same way that we should have always done it, in a holistic way, understanding who we're trying to serve and what capabilities we got. AI becomes a tool to help that rather than a solution that, a panacea to kind of, cure all ills. So when we're talking to industries around the world, companies, these are the kind of things we're hearing at the moment. There are probably similar things in your organizations. Our AI is very internal. We're automating things we used to do. Our call centers are getting better. Our databases are becoming more coherent. We've got people building some proof of concepts, but they're not really necessarily joined up. We don't know how we'll monetize AI. We don't know how we'll secure it. So all of those questions are kind of circling around in organizations. I think what it's ultimately showing us as a challenge is that, AI at the minute is very incremental, it's quite tactical, it's very inward looking. People are waiting to see what other people do before they choose their own path. And I think that means we're starting to use it in a business as usual way, and we're not looking at AI in the same way that we should be looking at innovation, creativity in a holistic and long-term view. A good example of that would be, we think about real world needs and AI opportunities. So imagine you're going through a dialysis treatment at home. If you're an 85-year-old, tired, it's late at night, you're having to interact with very complex technical products in your own house, that are critical, they're life critical, but design hasn't yet been able to intervene in the way that it should. Lots of design engineering in every product that's made in the dialysis space, but maybe not enough empathy and humanity in there yet. And AI could play roles in that. AI can understand, observe, synthesize, but design still has to solve those problems. We still have to understand what challenges people face, and then how do we go about, unlocking and changing those problems. We'll jump to some examples about. I think Matt will probably jump in at this point. This is an example of a client in the wellness space rather than healthcare. This is the world's biggest maker of treadmills and so running machines and kind of gym equipment. We were just fortunate enough to be awarded Time Magazine's Best Invention of 2025 for a new running machine we just launched. And maybe Matt,
I think it's a good example of just pausing business as usual and taking a look at that process end to end. And companies have to want to do it. There needs to be that desire to say, we can do better in all areas. And I think our team, and it's a complicated team, of specialists across all types of disciplines, joins at the beginning and finishes together at the end with their team to deliver on that message, on that desire to change something, to gather that kind of feedback that says this is a significant moment in this company's history and they're changing direction. And that can feel heavy and it can feel really challenging, but I think with that multidisciplinary holistic approach, you can work through that problem and get to these kind of results.
Yeah, so the challenge here was to make the world's best running machine, but actually it was even more than that, make the world's best running experience. So everything we created, from the vibrations in the track that you run on, through to the stability of the screen or the controls that you use, if you're running at 13 miles an hour and you're in a gym and you see that happening, people dismount the treadmill by essentially jumping in the air and then opening their legs and hoping to stand on the edge of the running machine while the running machine's still going. People fall off, people hurt themselves. So even designing all those touch points to be the most intuitive, the most beautiful and understandable they can be, but also highly functional. It's kind of an example of taking that holistic approach, but then going even further beyond that. We've just spent the last 8 months creating, the digital aspect of that very experience. So, we probably all would like more fitness coaching in our lives, be motivated, have people challenge us, people understand our capabilities, where we are in our fitness journey or our health journey. So we help build a AI fitness coach. So democratizing, fitness and knowledge for every user. So this is a digital platform. You can engage, you can chat. The platform understands what you're doing. It tailors your goals. And both interactions with hardware, but also off machine, outdoors, running, all of that can be coordinated. If you think of the way fitness experiences exist at the moment, they're kind of very siloed. We have our Apple Watch, maybe, we might have an Aura Ring, we might have, some connected equipment, but none of it's coherent and connected. It doesn't actually come together. It doesn't help us on that journey, and we don't achieve what we would want to achieve. And I think that's it's a good kind of lesson for us to take into the healthcare space as well, to be more holistic. Very often in the healthcare space, companies are quite siloed. They take as advanced approach they can to their part of the journey, and I think it's important that we actually start to look beyond that.
Hi, Marcus. Just to say, you've got a question in the chat from Claire, saying multidisciplinary and holistic means more people, which means more funds. How can we use this model to persuade investors to invest? We feel restricted by being unable to have wide enough reach due to cost.
Yeah, I definitely hear that challenge. I'd say that's probably, when we talk about one of the secret weapons, I think that's where design really can play a strong role. To be able to, and a holistic approach to design with capabilities doesn't necessarily cost more. If you look at time to market, accelerating that. If you look at quality of outcomes, you can justify the extra investment, and sometimes it isn't even an extra investment. On most of the programs we see in most big healthcare companies, the teams are huge, but they're just not coordinated. They're not in sync. So again, back to that kind of bat and pass moment, it doesn't happen. Or perhaps the innovation or the aspiration around innovation isn't crystallized early enough in the journey. And again, I think design can play a role in doing that, which can inspire investors. There's a lot of people can make a lot of money from investing in companies that have a true vision, and it's difficult for investors to want to wait 5, 6, 7 years to understand whether there will be a return on their investment. And I think design can be used to inspire confidence in that. So hopefully people start to look, or we can look and become advocates for the fact that it doesn't cost more. We actually believe it can cost less to bring that multidimensional approach. And the earlier and more upstream we bring it, it's critical, because the earlier that happens, the earlier you're in line as an organization. The more unified your vision, the faster you can progress. We've seen, this is a good example on screen now. This is a Trinity Biotech, an Irish publicly listed healthcare company who've just moved into the diabetes space, wearable glucose monitoring space. Small company, not huge budgets. They acquired a technology to be able to get a sensor wire into the skin to read glucose levels, and that was the beginning of the journey for them. So we've helped paint a vision for them that has helped both with investors, but it's also helped health systems to understand what the potential of continuous glucose monitoring can mean in markets that previously were inaccessible. We've got hugely successful companies out there, Abbott, Dexcom, have changed the game when it comes to understanding somebody's journey with diabetes. The challenge is those systems and solutions are very expensive. So here design was used in a holistic way to massively reduce cost, but also to massively improve user experience. No needle or cannula required to insert the wire into the skin means that we can reuse the technology. This is a modular solution that allows you to keep the expensive bit, the high-tech bit, which means we can massively reduce the cost to serve people in diabetes, which can mean, from the research we've done in places like in India, where healthcare practitioners are having to make the difficult choice of only giving continuous monitoring to users for a part of a month. They get to use CGM for maybe a week, 2 weeks in a month, but not the whole month because it's too expensive. So I think design can help solve that. It can help engineering challenges, it can help in production challenges, and it can help in setting the vision. And it can also help to develop additional solutions, such as again, integrating AI to reduce cognitive load. So people becoming obsessed with their with their time in range, with their glucose charts. It can be very helpful, but it can also be very anxiety driving. So actually, here we're using AI in this platform to synthesize information, but also to not overwhelm and overburden people with complex data. Healthcare practitioners are great with data; they love the numbers. If my dad is 81, not so great at understanding new terminology and new technologies, but he can adapt and understand simple messages. And when an issue is there to be raised or something important that has to be flagged, you can do that. We don't have to overwhelm with data on a day-to-day basis. Again, speaking of that design journey, so this is Illumina. So they're based in San Diego. We've been working with them for 6-7 years now. And when we first met them, they already had design. So the products on the left-hand side are the designs that they had. In a sense, nothing wrong with them, perfectly acceptable industrial design. So packaged hardware, so complex components, systems, architecture, packaged sensitively with shape, plastic moldings and form. There's nothing wrong with that, but Illumina's ambition was to go beyond that. It was to change the very nature of the products from day one. So not to say, here's a complex package, can you make it look as nice as possible by just skinning it with design, but actually going back to what's the best way of using a product, what's the best way of interacting, what's the most beautiful but most understandable. So for the last 6-7 years, we've built out their whole portfolio of product from perfectly acceptable design to design that actually is transformational, in terms of user experience, in terms of their brand. It speaks to the quality of company they are and they want to be. So that's an issue of integrating design, engineering, science together early in the project rather than late. The first examples were design is brought in late and you get to skin the package that has been locked down. With Illumina, we've had the ability to change that perception, to say, well, actually, we can help to innovate, to engineer, to build, and we can do that physically and we can do that digitally. So we can make beautiful interactions that help the user understand how to use a product, how to not misuse a product. In genome sequencing, it's hugely valuable and hugely critical. So making errors or mistakes, which is the norm in this kind of laboratory space, isn't acceptable. It has a huge cost and a huge burden. So we were able to, change both the physical, digital, electromechanical elements of all of their products to become kind of flagships for what a good design vision can deliver. And probably the testament to that is the way people talk about their machines. I mean, it's not often you get people falling in love with a piece of lab equipment, but it's not a bad thing if you can get people to emotionally connect, to understand the quality. The products have to work beautifully as well, but from the science standpoint, but why can't they work beautifully in terms of the interactions, the day-to-day use. We're not making things more complex. We're making things faster, less learning time, more throughput of testing. So it's kind of a win-win. And the last example I think we'll talk about is a kind of the challenge we come across quite a lot. That we don't always get to see the outcomes from the journey we go on. We can build medical equipment and see it in hospitals, but may not always be in the room to understand the difference that it makes. So when we talk about being purpose-driven, this was a story that kind of resonated with us and touched us. So this is Gary. He's a florist who lives, who has a market stall just opposite, one of our team here at Native. Very lovely guy. He would stop and would always stop at one of the other mats here at Native and have a chat with him, just talk about what's going on in life. And one day that conversation was a bit darker than normal. This was the conversation where Gary had revealed that he'd had a terrible time. He'd been rushed into hospital. He was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. He was bleeding from his bowel. He had an immediate operation. He was in hospital for quite a long time, and then he came out with a stoma. So he didn't even know what one of those was at one point. So he's now, now his feces, his output would come out of his stomach. He'd had his, challenging moments with that, and he now was sent home, and it was horrible. He had an ostomy bag adhered to his stomach. It would leak. It would smell. He was embarrassed. He was humiliated. He didn't want to go out of the house. And Matt was empathetic as much as he could about that. And he mentioned that we'd actually designed a range of ostomy bags for a company called Coloplast. He gave him the details. And went on his way. The next week was kind of, he met with Gary, and Gary mentioned that things were even worse. His tests had come back. It looked like he may have colon cancer, and it was pretty traumatic for him. He was worried about his family, he was worried about his future. But he then mentioned the last moment that actually, though, he bought some of the ostomy bags, he got hold of them, and then he got his GP to order him some more, and he said they were life-changing. They worked, which is what you'd expect from a product. It should work, but it worked not just in terms of, it didn't leak, poo all over his shirt or in bed. It actually worked in a way that he had some dignity. The quality of the product that he was using on a day-to-day basis was better. He was thankful to Matt. Look, it's still a challenging situation, but in those most challenging situations is where we probably should be doing the most in terms of design rather than the least. So our journey with Coloplast, this intimate healthcare company in Denmark, they make catheters and ostomy bags and anal irrigators. So all the kind of things that, probably as a designer growing up, designers would sketch cars or mobile phones. But, here was an industry that had almost been untouched for 50 years. We started working in this space, and it was the most rewarding, most joyous, fascinating space to be in, even though it's dealing with challenging issues, bowel movements, things we don't generally like to talk about in polite society, turn out to be some of the most fantastic human and life-affirming areas to work in. So we helped Coloplast over 9 years redesign every product in that portfolio, catheters, ostomy bags, and that transformed their business. It transformed everyone who worked in their business to want to do more, to achieve more. And the world also looked at that and said, this is a great company. This is a great industry. More should happen. So we mentioned at the beginning, their share price went through the roof. But everything we did either cost the same amount of money as the thing they were already doing or less. And I think that's where there was the comment about, can design be seen as being more expensive, adding premium, but also adding cost? Actually, I think design can reduce cost and elevate quality and experience if done well. And I think our challenge collectively is to insist that it is done well, it's done beautifully, it's done with the care and attention that somebody like Gary deserves, and somebody working in a lab deserves, everybody deserves. Design should be at the forefront of healthcare not something that follows after the science.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think thinking back to that project, one of the most important pieces was soliciting the right answers to key questions. That key piece about cost. Part of the work of the team, of the design team that was cutting through the different delivery disciplines within that organization, was to ask the key questions at the beginning and then shortcut to the end and go to the guy on the line, on the production line, and just check the assumptions. Say, could this be like this? Could we change that to be like that? Why would that change anything? And those modifications, those tweaks, there are still bags at the beginning, there's still bags at the end, and they still ran on the same production line. We just modified all of the touch points that had been not cared for in the same way that they could have been cared for, or designed in the way that made them more easy to use or beneficial.
So they became bags that you could wear in the shower without them disintegrating or wetting your clothes. Bags that you could have sex and not be embarrassed. You could date people. You could look better. Filters that were better, so you didn't smell everywhere you went. Just all those abilities to empty, to change, to clean, to dispose. That's design employed, in an end-to-end way, and it can have big effects when that's delivered. And it's not just for companies like Coloplast; it can happen in high-tech spaces as well. So just started to think about summarizing, some of those points, hopefully, that we've raised. First point being, hopefully we've started to show that design innovation within organizations will create value. And again, we don't see this as purely being, bringing great consultants and you'll solve the problem. It might be bringing great consultants and work with internal teams to change hearts and minds, add new capabilities, new skills, increase speed, increase ambition, but create the value that really matters. And that's value to end users like Gary, and its values to shareholders. And design has more of an opportunity than ever, particularly when we start thinking about new technologies, thinking about AI, robotics. Design has and should have a role to play in delivering those into the world in the right way. So the second point was, don't allow purpose to become an excuse. A lot of people that work in the healthcare space will talk about being user-centric. We'll talk about the studies that are done. We'll talk about user efficacy, but won't necessarily always question whether the things they make are great. And I think we can all look at portfolios of companies, of products, of systems we come across in day-to-day life or at the most challenging points in life. A bedside monitor that beeps all night and keeps you awake at the point when you really could do with sleep and recovery. Those things can be changed. Things can be overcome. The status quo doesn't have to remain the status quo, and we should use our purpose to push forward to change those issues rather than to be accepting of them. We're doing the best we can. It's a challenging environment. There's not a lot of money. Let's use the money we have wisely. The next point is about collaboration. Collaboration should create the conditions for innovation. Collaboration itself isn't innovation. I think that's important to understand, that there still has to be a point where decisions are made, visions are created and shared and judged. It can't just be that you end up with groupthink. You end up with everyone adding a little bit and hoping that makes it good. So we need to make sure that collaboration is there more to fuel the innovation process than it is to be the innovation process itself. So it's still critical, but it's not enough on its own if you don't have that spark of creativity, a vision that actually builds momentum. And then I think hopefully in all the examples we talk about, we're trying to be as multidimensional as possible, and things can always be more. They can always be more considered, thought through. We can't afford to delay, so we have to stay open throughout the process. No company has years and years at the very beginning to figure out what to do. This is happening whilst progressing at great pace, but it still has to be considered in the whole. That holistic view is critical and ultimately will massively save time. You know, if you get things right at the beginning, the pathway won't be smooth, but you won't hit any points where you suddenly have to go into reverse, you know, or you're off a cliff edge because the thing you hoped would work didn't work. It got bogged down by reality, technology, you know, user engagement, behavior testing, whatever it is, you know, with the tools and capabilities and processes that exist within and around design today, there's no excuse for not being able to consider that in a multidimensional, fully formed way from the beginning and every day throughout the development of products and services. And then that last point, that we think bad design costs much, much more than great design. You know, obviously in the end outcomes, you know, the companies who embrace design do better, but even in the process itself. So, you know, the timeframes around design development, you know, tooling costs, you know, technology acquisition, integration, software development, they're all processes that, you know, have a cost and a time associated with them. You know, if you spend that money and that time but don't get the outcomes that, you know, your company wants or deserves, then the costs are incredible. So design can actually be the opposite of what I think people often think it as being, which is something that, you know, adds, you know, icing on top of a cake. It can actually help understand the ingredients. It can help understand, you know, how to do things, and it can massively, massively save time, particularly in areas like ours, which are often regulated. Often there are timeframes that have to be obeyed. Getting it wrong in one of those spaces is catastrophic. So again, let's champion design as a holistic tool that can not just add design to products and services that have already been conceived, but can actually work throughout the whole development structure of companies, portfolios, and products. So hopefully that was useful. Thank you all. Thank you, SEHTA.
Thank you very much. I think that was an actually really interesting session. We haven't had any more questions in, so I'll open up the floor now to everybody that's here. And if you do want to ask any questions, you can post them in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand using the raise your hand icon, we can activate your microphone and camera. The slides will be shared, as we said in the chat, as a PDF, and also you get a link to the recording, so do look out for them as well. I can't see anybody else. Claire Brook-Little, you asked some questions. Yep, you've asked another question. Lovely. Is Native a company?
I guess that first question tells me that I messed up at the beginning. Yes, we are a company. We're a design company, and we're based in London, and we work with companies around the world in many different industries. So yes.
Thank you, Claire. Andy, no questions, but thanks very much. Very inspiring and makes so much sense. Claire says, thank you very much for the answering the question. She came a little bit late to the session, so she didn't get the first bit. I don't see any other questions from anybody, so I will take that as everyone's happy. Thank you once again to Matt and Marcus for a really good session, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you further along in the year. Thank you very much, and have a good day, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.